Good afternoon. It's another Monday, and I'm going to continue with the story. The story, of course, is from this book titled Where's the Rest of the Body? It was the second book that I wrote in the series. I've written many since then, so the characters I've come to know very well. As usual, you can see I've got my ghostly friend to one side, Walter, who's in essence. And as you look carefully in the background, you see Sammy the Skull and Billy Bones, just over my one shoulder. We've reached a point in the story where Chief Petrovic is certain he knows who the killer is. The trick is getting her back into Canada from the United States. So they weren't sure how they're going to do that because it would be difficult to extradite her since she's now an American citizen, and the proof they have that she committed the murder of her parents and cut them up into pieces isn't very good. It's circumstantial at best. So, of course, they came up with a ruse to do this. They put an ad in the newspaper. There's the advertisement. I just put it on the screen. They ran it in the Toronto newspapers and in the major newspapers in Illinois because they suspected that's where Nancy Featherstone, A.K.A Henny, had traveled. If you look at it, you'll see in the advertisement that it's trying to get someone who wants some money back into the country. They're looking for a lost heir, so to speak. And in the last episode, we saw that Nancy Featherstone, A.K.A Henny, had read in her newspaper, I think it was a Springfield, Illinois newspaper, that there was money to be made if she could identify herself as Henny. Well, that was no problem because before she murdered the poor woman, she took her identification. So let's see what's happening now. So the story, I'm going to read from my manuscript here, one of the original manuscripts. And in the story, Henny Allenby steps out of the cab and glances around. I do like Toronto. Depending on how large an inheritance I've come into, I may purchase another smaller home here in this city. Toronto was a growing modern city with a population of about 650,000. Remember, this is 1933. It's only 200,000 behind Montreal. The Toronto Islands would be a great location. The Yacht Club Harbor is there, and there are rumors that they might build an airport on that island. Of course, you know now there is an airport there. Henny was so caught up in her thoughts that she walked right by the door to the lawyer's office. She quickly realized her mistake, spun around, and walked back and abruptly entered 186 Yonge Street. The receptionist was a prim, middle-aged woman who looked extremely efficient and probably didn't have a sense of humor. The nameplate in front of her desk said, Maureen Thatcher. May I have your name, please? Inquired the receptionist. Henrietta Harriet Allenby, she said. That's my given name. Most people just call me Henny. Which lawyer are you here to see? Asked Maureen. Oh, I don't have an appointment, said Henny. Her manner seemed to suggest that she was so important she didn't require appointments. Well, I'm not sure how we can help you. Please tell me the nature of your business, then perhaps I can arrange to have one of our lawyers see you. I'm sorry, I'm not from Toronto, and I'm not from Canada. I need to see someone today, and now is preferable, said Henny in a very commanding voice. Frowning, the receptionist said, I'll see what I can do, but you'll have to tell me the nature of your business first. I told you my name. I'm surprised you didn't recognize it, said Henny, continuing in an all too important manner. You probably prepared the notice for the newspaper. You should pay more attention to your work. Maureen kept repeating to herself, the customer's always right. The customer's always right. I must be polite. I must be polite. She took a deep breath and tried to smile and said, I apologize that I didn't recognize you. We've been very busy. Do you have a copy of the newspaper notice? From her very expensive purse, Henny produced her copy of the newspaper notice. As you can see, and if you can hear, she added impolitely, I'm here about my inheritance. Oh, yes, of course, said the receptionist. Mr. Tome is looking after that matter. I'll get him for you now. You may have to wait a few minutes. He's currently with another client. Thank you, said Henny, somewhat mollified now by the apparent respectful manner of the receptionist. About 10 minutes later, Mr. Tome appeared. He was a small, neat man in his mid-50s with a ready smile. He greeted Henny graciously and asked if she'd accompany him back to his office. He then called in the receptionist, Maureen, and asked, would you please prepare coffee for us? And if you'd go to the bakery down the street and purchase a couple of those excellent pastries they're famous for here in the city. Mr. Tome was very efficient and used the 10 minutes that Henny had been spent waiting for him in the reception area. Prior to her arrival, in his office, he'd made 2 important telephone calls. The first one was to Chief Petrovic in Chaseford. Mr. Tome loved detective stories. When the chief answered his telephone, he heard a voice. At first he didn't recognize it, and then he heard it. It said, hello, it's Tome. We've landed the fish. Chief Petrovic quickly caught on. He answered, make sure it's an allowable catch. We don't want a problem with the game warden. There was a pause at the other end of the line. Then Petrovic said, take some time to make certain that she has the proper credentials that identify her as Henrietta Harriet Allenby. Once you've verified her status, you may have to stall for time. I've talked to the assistant chief in charge of detectives in Toronto last week. I'll call him now as soon as I hang up. The assistant chief has promised he will send someone to your office promptly. Lawyer Tome waited 3 or 4 minutes and then phoned the Toronto police and asked for the assistant chief. Sorry, that was Chief Petrovic that was waiting. So he asked for the assistant chief in charge of detectives. When he was put through and mentioned his name, the chief said, yes, I'll have one of my detectives sent your way now. Sent to the lawyer's office now. Meanwhile, back in the lawyer's office, they're eating their pastries, drinking their coffee. I do love these pastries, said Mr. Tome. I'm sure you will enjoy them. Henny thought, this fellow seems a very pleasant gentleman. I wonder if he's married. Then she said, you're very thoughtful, Mr. Tome. I'm certain the pastries will be most delightful. Well, I guess we'd better get down to business, Tome said. I'll need to see some identification. You wouldn't want to give the money to the wrong person. He chuckled. Henny smiled back and chuckled, oh, I'm the right person. Here's a copy of the letter from the Central Registry files of the Immigration Branch of the Canadian government that was sent to Harold and Marjorie Marion Featherstone, verifying my arrival in Toronto. They picked me up in Toronto in May of 1901. I was only 11 years old at the time. The world was a very confusing place to me. The Featherstones were very good to me. When I heard they had disappeared, I was devastated. Mr. Tome looked at her sympathetically. He was disguising his feelings as best he could. He was good at it. He had been acting in courtrooms in Toronto for many years. Do you have any current identification? He inquired. Henny produced her Illinois driver's license and her American passport. He looked at them and said, "Well, everything seems to be in order. I need to step out of the office. If the receptionist returns with the pastry before I get back, please help yourself." He smiled and left. A moment later, as she sat there was a knock on the door, and two men entered the room. One was obviously a policeman in uniform, and the other just behaved like a policeman. Henny was startled. She'd been expecting either Mr. Tome or the receptionist. She didn't know what to think. She wasn't left wondering for long. The plainclothesman said, "I'm Detective Pilsner. You're under arrest for the murder of Henrietta Harriet Allenby." Ha! The woman started to scream before he finished the name. I'm not going to scream. It won't be any good for me or for this program. But trust me, she was screaming. And then she shouted, "You're out of your mind. I just proved a few minutes ago to the lawyer from this very office that I am Henrietta Harriet Allenby. I'm alive. I didn't kill myself. What are you talking about?" And then she started screaming again. The uniformed officer cuffed her, and that momentarily caused her to rant even louder. Detective Pilsner waited her out. When she paused for breath, he said, "Do you want to leave the building quietly, or do you want the two of us to carry you out to the cruiser?" "I'll go with you," she said, "but you're making a big mistake. This is total nonsense. I'm not talking to anybody until I get a lawyer." Well, Henny did quiet down. The two policemen took her out into the reception room, where she started screaming again, especially when she saw Tome and the receptionist drinking coffee and eating those special pastries. They managed to force her out through the front door of 186 Young Street and into the cruiser. Needless to say, it was not a pleasant ride to the police station. Meanwhile, as soon as the telephone with lawyer Tome had ended, this is back in Chaseford, Chief Petrovic brought Constable Peter Herman into the office. "I know you love to drive, Peter," said the chief, smiling. "Of course, you know what that means. Our plan is working. Henry Allenby, or Henry Featherstone, or Henny McCann, that's her married name, saw the newspaper notice and crossed the border to Toronto to collect her inheritance. Well, we've got her right where we want her. With all those names, it's a wonder she can keep track of herself." "When do we leave?" asked Peter. "Oh, we need to leave right now. It'll take us 2.5 hours to get to Toronto. Let's allow 3 hours, because it takes time to get to the police station to find Henny. It's about 10:30 right now. If we leave now and stop for an hour for lunch, we should be at the Toronto police station about 2:30. So they're making their drive to Toronto. And of course, Henny's been apprehended already and taken to the Toronto police station. "Are we going to interview her in Toronto?" Chief asked Peter. "No, I want to bring her back to Chaseford. That's closer to the scene of her crimes. Maybe that will upset her." "I know she won't feel bad. I don't think she's capable of remorse," said Chief Petrovic. "Oh," said Peter, "so we'll get the pleasure of her company all the way back?" "Yes. Aren't you happy that we have that heavy screening installed between the front seat and the back seat?" "Yeah, I guess," said the constable. "Okay," said the chief, "let's go get in that car." Well, as predicted, they pulled into the parking lot at about 2:30. They'd had a decent lunch, and the last part of the trip had gone smoothly. The chief and Constable Herman thought they were prepared for the brief meeting at the Toronto police station. They'd take custody of the prisoner, formerly identified now as Henny McCann, and then they would transport her back to Chaseford. They arrived at the police station. They waited at the desk, but then they could hear quite a tumult behind the closed doors of the hallway to their left. Suddenly the doors burst open and a cuffed woman in restraints was carried towards them by two burly policemen. The woman, at a very high volume, was shouting something that sounded like Toronto Secret Police, Nazi pigs, laced profusely with profanities that seemed to increase in volume and vulgarity the closer she approached the desk. "Package for the Chaseford Police," shouted one of the burly policemen. He could scarcely be heard above the screaming vitriol spewing from the bundled prisoner. "We'd like to complete this exchange as soon as possible," he shouted. "The assistant chief told us if you wished, we could place her in your vehicle for you once the transfer paperwork has been completed." "We'd appreciate that," shouted back Chief Petrovic. He took the policeman aside so he could speak in a more normal voice and said, "How long has she been screaming like this?" "Oh, only since she was apprehended, Chief," answered the policeman. "Oh, my goodness." With the paperwork complete and the packaged prisoner installed in the back of the police car behind the protective screen, Chief Petrovic and Constable Herman reluctantly climbed into the front of the police cruiser. They didn't know what to expect on the trip back. The return trip. The first 45 minutes of the trip was torture. Petrovic and Herman agreed beforehand not to respond to any of their passengers' shoutings. At times, the desire to gag her or slap her was almost overwhelming. Instead, they stopped the car about every 10 minutes and got out of the car for a break to get away from the noise. Eventually, the shouting began to die down. The shouting was now replaced by a continual litany of demands. That noise level was easier to ignore. By the time they reached Chaseford, A.K.A Stratford, there was only an occasional demand or comment from the rear seat of the car, and he seemed to have calmed down considerably. The chief and Constable Herman had weathered the storm, although they did both have serious headaches. It was about 6 o'clock when they reached the police station. "I won't want both constables, Jarvis and Franklin, out here to remove her from the car," said Petrovic. "You stay in the car, Pete, while I go and make a couple of phone calls. You can get out of the car if the noise gets too loud." Jarvis and Franklin, the two young constables, were in the police station, and when the chief went in, he said, "Sorry to interrupt your evening. We need your help. So far, she's been a very difficult prisoner. Incidentally, she married a fellow a few years ago, and now her name is legally Henny McCann." Well, Jarvis and Franklin said nothing, but thought that at that moment, Henny appeared calm and rested. She looked okay, although Chief Petrovic and Chief Herman appeared haggard. Well, they knew better than to ask about the trip. Petrovic pointed at Jay and Joel, said, "You two are taking her the next time she has to be escorted anywhere." The chief appeared to be very grumpy. Jarvis and Franklin were able to escort Henny McCann to her cell and removed her restraints without any problems. Then they said that she'd receive her supper within half an hour. When they said that, she said, "Well, thank you very much. I'm quite hungry. I didn't get any lunch. You two are the nicest policemen I've ever met." When she said this, it was within the earshot of Petrovic and Herman. They looked at each other in astonishment. "Is that the same person we met at the police station and drove all the way to Chaseford with, screaming in the back?" "Well, the change in her behavior is amazing," said Peter Herman. "She sounds like a completely different person. I wonder." Thank you for listening.